Have you checked the front fuel tank crossmember on your Suzuki Sidekick or GMC/Geo Tracker? If you haven't, you should, because it probably looks a lot like this. Catastrophic rust on these crossmembers is a very, very common issue on the 1989 to 1998 Suzuki Sidekick, GMC and Geo and Chevy Tracker. This crossmember, as you can see, supports the front of the fuel tank. It also has attached to it the fuel filter. And it also supports the tops of the shocks. Generally, in most cases, these portions are still pretty much intact, so looking from the outside of the vehicle, you wouldn't think that there's as much rot as there is. But at least here in BC, where we have a lot of wet weather and salted roads, this is super common. So today, I will show you the way to replace this properly. The common thing to do is to just pound a piece of Schedule 40 pipe through there and then hope for the best, because generally these brackets here will still be roughly attached to the tube. So what happens when you take that approach is you basically just bridge this awful portion and sometimes non-existent portion in the middle to hold things semi-straight. But being as the tube is rotted to that point, it sure can't be trusted that these brackets will stay in place. So I really discourage that method. I think that is a very, very poor way of attempting to fix the crossmember. What you want to do is replace that entire tube and weld those brackets to the tube. And again, I'm going to show you just how to do that. All right, so to replace this crossmember, first thing to do, disconnect the battery, because we're going to be doing some plasma cutting and welding, so always disconnect your battery. But in terms of physical stuff, you want to remove this bash bar. This is basically a bar that protects the, or is meant to protect the fuel tank from rear end collisions. This particular one has had a receiver welded to it by someone else. This is certainly far from my work, I can assure you that. But anyway, it's been welded up to the crash bar, and unfortunately the bash bar has also been welded to the frame. So I'm not going to be able to remove this. I mean, of course I could cut it off, but I'm going to try to work around it, because the customer might actually use this to move some very light stuff around his property or something like that on a trailer. I hope he doesn't use it on the road. Again, not my work. But what you'll want to do is just remove that bash bar, because that will give you a little more clearance. So 14mm socket again for these two, and obviously the same over on the other side here, the driver's side. Take those out and away you go. Other thing to do is remove the wheels. I've removed the passenger side. I'm about to remove the driver's side. Again, just to give yourself some access and space. And eventually once we get to the point that we're going to start cutting that cross member out, you're going to want those wheels off, because we're going to have to strap the axle up in order to remove the shocks and not have the axle come swinging down too far. So for that, we want to have the wheels off as well. Next thing to do is to remove the fuel tank and the fuel tank skid plate as one. The fuel tank skid plate is secured to the frame right here with a 14mm head as well, so take that out first. Other than that, the skid plate is secured only where the tank is also secured. So right here on the back, this is 14mm, as is the driver's side, of course. And then if you want to take that off, I believe that's actually a 12, but there's no need to take that off because that's attached to the fuel tank itself, so it'll just come off as a unit. And then if we get up under the vehicle and look at that crossmember that we're going to replace, there's the brackets to which the tank is bolted, and again, those are 14mm, so take those guys off. And you can also remove the banjo fitting for the fuel filter right there, the fuel tank side, not the vehicle side at this point. And then that way you're ready to drop the tank. But before you do all that, you've definitely got to have something in place to support the tank. And I have just a piece of 1/4 inch plate welded to a piece of tube which goes into one of my telescopic stands. So it does the job quite well, but you could easily do it with any kind of blocking, you know, any kind of stand you can configure. So just make sure you've got something to support the tank. I'm obviously going to drop the vehicle down much closer to the stand before I go ahead and start undoing bolts. I usually give myself about 3/4 of an inch to allow the tank to drop down before it contacts the plate. So I'm going to do that now. Here's another thing you can do to make things a little bit easier for you is just ratchet strap the tank up in place nice and firmly before you start undoing bolts, and then that way you can carefully undo those bolts, making sure the tank isn't shifting, and then you can lower the tank down onto your stand after that and basically release the strap and you're good to go, rather than kind of having to mess around a little bit. In my case, I've used the tie down points on the frame to go into here, and I would have done the same on the driver's side, except my strap has a really long strap coming off of the ratchet itself, so I wrapped it around the frame just to take up some of that space. Otherwise I would have gone into the tie down point on both sides. But just a quick tip. We're just about done, so let's move this one now. There we are, that's the final bolt. I have taken all 4 bolts out of the tank, 2 of which hold the skid plate on, and I've also removed the one bolt that holds the skid plate to the frame. So now the tank and skid plate are still secured to the frame by the ratchet strap, but we're also sitting on my stand, so I'm just going to release my ratchet strap now. And should be able to raise the vehicle up a little bit on the hoist. In your case, if you don't have a hoist, of course, you'll lower the tank a little bit on whatever set of blocks or jack or whatever you happen to have it on. But of course, you've got still all your fuel lines attached and some electrical, so you only want to lower it a little bit. Okay, so we're definitely free. You will need to remove the clamp that secures the fuel inlet to the fuel tank, and also the vent line there, and also these 2 lines which go to the engine, and also that banjo fitting which I mentioned earlier needs to be released. So let's get all those done now. Alright, so usually these guys are secured just by these little spring clips here, but you just pinch those in with a pair of pliers and slide them back on the hose like I did there. And then the others are going to be hose clamps like these. The little tiny ones will be probably a 1/4 inch socket that you need to loosen them, like I have on this one right here. And then the larger one is probably going to be a 5/16. But you want to release all of those and then gently release the hoses from the tank itself. Often they're going to be dried right on there and they'll be pretty challenging. So you want to just, you know, as gently as possible, wriggle them around, twist them. Twisting is a good action to release them, but rather than just trying to pull on them or push them. And once they're free, get them off of there, and then we can drop the tank. I've pulled off that hose that had the spring clamp on it. I have got the tiny little hose clamp loosened, and it wouldn't let go of my socket, but that's okay because that's the last one of those sizes that I had to undo. So I will get my socket off of there once the tank is out and I have more room. I've removed the vent line, that was easy enough, and the inlet line into the tank was pretty challenging as usual. I used a pair of slip joint pliers to kind of wriggle it free, and I grabbed a long screwdriver and pried in behind there. It's holding a tiny bit at the top where I couldn't pry very easily, but since all the other hoses are off now, I am going to put the tank onto the stand, release that strap, we'll raise the vehicle a little bit, and I should be able to wriggle the tank out of the inlet hose from there. For the fuel line that comes off of the fuel filter, you'll want a 19mm wrench for the filter housing and a 17mm wrench for the banjo bolt. So I've removed the banjo housing, or banjo fitting rather, from the filter housing, and I put the bolt back in just so I don't lose it. I did lose both the washers off of it. There's 2 copper washers, one for each side of the banjo fitting. Try not to lose them like I did. Anyway, this is a good opportunity to order a new fuel filter, because almost assuredly you'll want one. And it will, or it should come with those copper washers, but often they don't. So again, try not to lose them and keep those washers on hand in case you need to reuse them. They really shouldn't be reused, but it's a whole lot better than not having one if your filter doesn't come with enough. So now I am ready to lower this tank down. So we're gonna get the stand underneath, and then we'll release that strap. Alright, so now I just got to release the strap. And there we go. So now the fuel tank is sitting on the stand. We'll just simply pull the strap, and I can lift the vehicle, or in your case, you can lower the tank. So we're well away from those mounts, and we are also well away from those mounts. However, we are hanging up just by that one fuel hose, like I said, so I'm just going to give that a wriggle and that'll come down. The inlet hose is now free of the fuel tank. However, the tank is jammed between the backside of those brackets and this bar, which I wasn't able to remove, as I explained earlier. So you should not have this issue. At this point for you, it should drop, the tank should drop away easily, and there should just be some electrical connections that you can get to back here. 2 of them that you will disconnect. I'll show them to you in a minute once I get this thing down. For me, I think I can just pull hard on this and get it to come out, but it means that it's going to be not a lot of fun putting it back in. So we'll see how this goes. I hope I don't have to remove that awful receiver hitch contraption, but I may end up having to do just that. We'll see. Okay, so I've just lowered the tank on the stand a little bit to get better access to these wires, and there's the 2 plugs that I told you about. So you disconnect those 2 and you are done with fuel tank removal. Now that the gas tank is removed, we are going to, of course, in this case, be leaving this rear cross member intact. You may find in your vehicle that this cross member is rotten already. Please stay tuned for another video on replacing that one if that is the case, but generally these are a lot more solid than the front ones. So we'll assume that that's the case for you. So of course these mounts are going to stay in position and we don't have to worry about those, and we will use those as a guideline to position these front mounts onto our new cross member that we're going to create. So what we have to do is create a little jig so that we know that we're getting everything placed just correctly. In my case, I've got this stupid piece of crap receiver back here again that kind of gets in my way because I can't draw a nice straight line between my brackets since this is in the way. But in that case, what I did is I took a piece of angle iron and I cut a little center relief out of it so that I can slot it around that receiver. It's a bit difficult to get the camera in a position where you can see this really well, but again, I cut this center relief out of a piece of angle iron. I used angle iron rather than flat bar, basically because I had to go around this receiver, so of course I wanted some strength and rigidity, but it wouldn't hurt to use angle iron anyway because it does give you a much more rigid base, but you could use flat bar if you wanted. So all I did was cut this piece to 20.5 inches, which is the outsides of these brackets. So again, 20.5 inches wide, and then I just put my piece in place like so and simply marked where the holes were. I will measure that for you and give you that measurement as well, and then I drilled some holes of the appropriate size. These holes are 13/32 of an inch or 10 millimeter, and the holes are 19 inches apart on center. So that's your first step. So then we're going to bolt that into position, and we'll do exactly the same thing for the front mounts, and then we will join those pieces together. So I'll just pop this guy into place. And again, you'll have better access for your bolts than I do, because you'll be able to get your bash bar out of the way and it won't have a big receiver welded onto it like this one does. But I will get it done regardless. Again, this back part of the jig is 20.5 inches wide. The hole centers are 19 inches apart. And I wound up opening up those holes just a little bit. I went to 7/16 rather than 13/32 because I was just a tiny bit off on my hole centers, I guess. But now it fits really nicely. It's bolted in place. And the front one, I cut to the same length. It's a little wider than it needed to be, but I wanted to make it the same as the other one, so I could basically just make a square off of it. 20.5 inches wide. Hole centers are 17 and 15/16 inches apart, and again, they are 13/32 hole, and this time I did go 13/32 because they fit just right. Anyway, that's now bolted in place. I'm going to connect these two together with a piece that in my case is 13 and 15/16 long, but that doesn't really matter. It's the distance between hole centers that's critical, so I'll give you that measurement afterwards. We'll weld it up, pull it off, and then I'll give you that measurement. And then that way, if your cross member is so far gone that it's actually completely missing in the center and it started to tilt down, thereby changing the locations of these mounting points, you can use my jig as a guide as to how to rebuild this thing. Because of course, if these have bent down and changed their positions, you can no longer use those as a viable guide. So that's why I'm doing this for you. Well, the jig is all welded together, and I'm just going to let it cool now, and then I will remove it and we can take the final measurements and you can have them. Now, rather than creating a jig like this to remount my fuel tank by, I could have just used the fuel tank itself as a jig and bolted it back in place at the back, and then I could have bolted my brackets to the front of the tank and just simply lifted it in place once my new cross member is in place and tacked them to that cross member, then remove the tank and then fully weld them. But even tack welding is pretty darn dangerous around a gas tank, even if you do seal it up fairly well. The only really safe way to do it is to fill the gas tank with water. And if you do that, you've now contaminated your tank. You've got to drain it out really thoroughly and dry it completely, and probably even run an evaporative chemical in it to make sure all the water's out, and that's a big pain in the ass, so I didn't want to do that. So the jig is the better way. I would encourage you to certainly do the same, and if you are going to use your tank as a jig, only do it if you've got it filled with water. We're about halfway through now, so why not have a little intermission with the wonder dog, Jerry. Alright, so now we've got our jig on the bench here and we can measure it up. Again, the rear holes are 19 inches apart, and I went 7/16 diameter with those only because I was just slightly off on my hole center. 13/32 would have been ideal, or 10 millimeter. And these holes are the same size. These ones are 17 and 15/16 apart on center. 17 and 15/16 inches apart. These pieces are 20.5 inches wide. I made them symmetrical. But you can see, or maybe you can't see from your position, but the holes are basically, they're not aligned. I've drawn a center line down from this hole by just placing a square on the back of this material, and it basically comes to the outside edge of this hole here. So on the right hand side of the vehicle, the forward hole is inset by 1/4 inch on center as compared to the rear one. So again, the front hole is inset by 1/4 inch on center as compared to the rear on the right side of the vehicle. On the left side of the vehicle, I've projected that line forward again. And in this case,
the forward hole was inset by 1 inch as compared to the rear hole. Now let me be very, very clear. I have done this a bunch of times and I have come up with some small discrepancies in terms of that degree of inset on those holes. So the right hand side is sometimes as little as 1/8 of an inch, whereas I quoted it as 1/4 of an inch here on the video, and the left hand side is sometimes as little as 13/16 of an inch, where I quoted it as 1 inch. So it's really important that you do your own dry fit, put the tank back in, make sure that it fits in your case before you weld those brackets solid. I apologize for not having more concrete dimensions for you, but at least it gives you a bit of a guideline.
All right, so it is time now to cut this old cross member out. I've cleared away the electrical that was up here and the vent line, and on this side I took a large slot screwdriver and just pried all these fittings off of these little studs that hold the fuel line and brake line to the side of the frame, and I did that all the way along just so that I could pull these away really easily and give myself room when I want to get up in here to cut my my cross member out. So I'm going to use a plasma cutter for this. You could use a zip disc or a Sawzall or pretty much anything like that. Basically, you're just going to cut the cross member out right beside the frame, and then you'd have to take, if you don't use a plasma cutter, you'll have to take a die grinder to relieve the actual weld there and get out the part of the tube which is inside of the frame. In my case, I'll just plasma cut that right out of there. And again, over here, if you don't have a plasma cutter, we're going to remove these shocks, so they'll be out of the way, but you'd have to get a zip disc in behind here and relieve the tube away from the shock mount. But again, in my case, I'm just going to use a plasma cutter to make it a little easier on myself. So next thing I'm going to do now is strap up the axle so that it doesn't droop down too far, and then I will remove the shocks. So I am going to strap the axle probably into the tie down points on the rear of the frame there. So as you will have seen on time lapse, I cut that tube out using the plasma like I said I would, and I came nice and close to that shock tower without actually cutting into it. Initially I made a pass kind of about an inch in front of that point and left a section of tube in there just because it was easier to trim it out afterwards, come from underneath and kind of cut it away rather than trying to get at it from above. There's not a lot of access, so that's why I took that approach. The other side is the same, so I won't bother taking you over there, but I have left inside just this little collar of tube that I need to now remove from the frame. So what I did is, after I'd cut this flush, I just went in with my plasma cutter and kind of gave a bit of an angle and cut all around there to release that tube from the inside. Like I was saying, if you don't have a plasma, you're going to have to do that with a die grinder or something like that. But once you've got that little piece of tube loose in there, you're going to want to try to kind of cut it in half so you can take it out in two pieces. So critical that you get that out of there, and once it's out of there, we can get these holes cleaned up and we will cut ourselves a new cross member and take all the brackets off of the old one and start putting this thing back together. So I have trimmed away the very lasts of the material that I needed to in order to clear this side, and I've grabbed myself a scrap piece of the material that I'm going to use as a cross member, which is 1.5 inch diameter 120 wall round tube, and it fits in, oops, sorry, camera work is crummy, and it fits in very, very nicely. I got to open up this hole just the tiniest bit, which I'll use a die grinder for. I have done that same process to the other side of the vehicle and also to the insides of the frame, and the story is the same all around. You can see that I'm very, very close to the correct fit, but I just got to open up the tiniest bit. You don't want to have any gaps larger than you can weld, of course, otherwise you're going to have to plate this frame. If you have to do that, then what I recommend is you create a plate by cutting the outside dimensions of the plate that you're going to need, and then just take a hole saw and drill a 1.5 inch hole through that plate then you can slide the plate over your new cross member and run the plate up to the side of the frame and weld it up that way. But the better way is what I've done here, where you just are not leaving any extra material, and it's going to be weldable all the way around. You can see I've got one little hole right there that I'll have to fill, but that's not going to be a big deal. So there you go. I'll grab a die grinder, we'll open that up, and then we'll insert the new cross member. Okay, so I've done all the final finicky messing around to make this tube fit. Again, I used just a short piece of scrap tube just to make sure that each side worked independently. And then of course I had to pass the actual full cross member through to make sure that they worked together. And when I did that, I did have to make a couple tiny more little adjustments, and you may need to as well. Just make sure that you make those adjustments as minor as necessary, meaning that you take out as little bits of material as you possibly can, so that you don't have too big a gap to weld. So this tube is 42.5 inches long. 42.5 inches long, that's your measurement. So I'm going to pass this all the way through now, through the other side of the frame until I encounter a bit of resistance. I will bring you around to show you what that resistance is. And what that resistance is that it's just rubbing a little bit on the shock mount as it comes in, which there's no problem at all with that. It means we've got a really nice tight fit. You can see I've got too big of a gap down there. I might have to put a little plate over that. But absolutely everywhere else it looks great, including along the top of that shock mount. So we'll have good weld up there. So I will just knock that through gently with a hammer until we've got about 3/8 of an inch still protruding past the shock mount on each side. And at that point, I can go ahead and weld this guy in. All of the brackets from the old cross member will be added in situ, or in place. Nothing needs to be added to the cross member before we slide it through. In fact, if we added anything to the cross member first, we couldn't slide it through. So this is the next step. We're just going to center that up, get it nice and true, again about 3/8 of an inch sticking out each side, and then we will tack weld it, make sure we're happy, and then we'll fully weld it up. And there we are, all welded up and ready to go. Insides are done as well. And the other side. And it all worked out quite well. You can see I didn't have any issues blowing holes or anything like that, and I was able to fill all the small gaps that did exist. So that's that. Now we can go ahead and take off all of the brackets from the old cross member, which is right here. And I mean, look at just how rough this was. It was lucky it was still in a position where I could actually use it to create a jig by. But anyway, we'll remove this little bracket right here that has a threaded insert on it for the diff breather to be bolted to. We will remove this guy. This is the mount for the fuel filter. I've already removed the strap that holds the fuel filter itself on, but we'll remove this bracket from the cross member and we'll add it to the new cross member, and of course we'll remove our actual fuel tank mounts and clean those up and get them ready for re-welding on the new cross member. So that's the next step.
It's important to note that the brackets themselves are generally in very, very good condition, although the cross member that they're welded to is, as you see, completely rotted. This is true of the vehicle frame as well. You might expect that where the cross member goes through the frame would be rotted all around the cross member, but that is almost never the case. And like mentioned, the brackets are almost always in very, very good condition and can be reused as well. So I think what happened is Suzuki just sourced some really poor tubing that they used for their cross members throughout that line of vehicles. So just an unfortunate decision on their part, but the rest of it is very, very solid.
So with the brackets all cleaned up, I mounted them to the jig, and then I mounted them loosely, I should say. If you look here, you can see that it's very much loose, but they're mounted to the jig, and then I propped them up against the cross member here in position, and I use those, I use the pressure of those up against the cross member to allow me to rotate the jig up into place and then bolt the rear of the jig in. So I bolted that up nice and tight, and now my brackets do align really, really nicely with this tube. So that gives me a lot of confidence that I'm in the right location and that I did my jig correctly. So now I'm just going to tighten up these brackets, make sure they're nice and flush against the tubes like you see here. I will tack weld them. I won't fully weld them, but I'll do a tack at the top and the bottom of each side to make sure they're nice and stable. I'll take the jig off, and then I will mock the tank up into position, make sure that it actually fits really well again. I'll remove it. I will weld these fully. I'll add the little breather bracket. I'll add the fuel filter bracket, and then it's pretty much time to weld it all up and finish the job. I've positioned the fuel tank back in place, and of course the rear mounts fit up perfect because we never adjusted those. For me, it was a struggle getting this tank back into place thanks to that stupid receiver again. So I actually did it without the skid plate. For you, you could leave the skid plate on, and I'm sure you'll have no problems at all because you won't have that in the way. But the important thing is, there's our front brackets. And as you can see, they are loosely bolted in, and they both fit really, really well. So needless to say, I'm very happy with that. So there you are, both mounts back in place and perfectly positioned. So now I will remove the tank, weld those mounts up fully, add the breather to the center of the breather mount, to the center of the cross member, and then I will add the fuel filter mount in its location, which I'll show you in just a minute. And there we are, fully welded. The fuel filter bracket is back on. I'll add the strap before I paint all that so I don't get paint in the threads of those little holes. And I've even added the fuel line, the diff breather bracket, although it's useless in this case because this vehicle has a 4.5-inch lift. One thing you might notice when you're done your welding is that some of your stock seam sealers / undercoat stuff will have peeled back. Good idea to chisel as much of that away as you possibly can before you put your new coating on, just so that your new coating adheres to the metal as best as possible. But that is about it. Once you've made it to that point, it's pretty much paint it up, put it back together, and you have got a solid rig. The job is done. So I ran some seam sealer up in there just to fill that little gap where I couldn't weld, and once that was dry, I undercoated the rest of the job and obviously put the shocks back in, connected up all my fuel line fittings, and put that skid plate back on. It was easy enough to put the skid plate on after the tank was in place, but it was pretty challenging to put them on as a pair with that receiver back there. So there you are, wires are all secured, hoses and lines are all secured, everything's done and good. One thing you want to check fairly closely is your banjo fitting on your fuel filter. So I ran the vehicle and made sure that there was absolutely no leaks, and there are absolutely no leaks. But there you are, fuel filter is back in its location. If you're wondering which side of the gas tank bracket it straddles the side that's closer to the frame. So that's it, she's a wrap. I'm gonna drop this thing back on the ground once I get some wheels on it, and I get to go home.
And there you are. That is the end of another video. Thank you so much for sticking through to the end. If you'd like to support my channel, please like, comment, and more importantly than anything, please subscribe. Let's have a look at a few pictures of a cross member even worse than the one we just repaired. This one was literally missing, like I said, they sometimes are. So just an example of how very bad they can be. There's the remnants of it on the ground there. But even in a case like that, you've got really solid, usable mounts. It's funny how that material holds up so much better than the tube to which it's attached to, and you can see there I've reused them successfully again. You will find little discrepancies between models of sidekicks and between years of sidekicks. It's funny just how many little parts they have that are just slightly different than the next vehicle. And one of those is actually these fuel tank brackets. Generally, you'll find that they have a half circle cut out of them, but some, like this one here, have a full circle cut out. So just another one of those little parts where you will find some differences. Anyways, thanks again. Have a good one.